All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are exploring one of the most dramatic intellectual revolutions in human history. We're looking at how society fundamentally reshaped the way we understand and punish crime. I mean, imagine a world where a crime wasn't considered a human choice, but literally a demonic possession. And imagine a justice system where a trial involved plunging your arm into boiling water just to prove your innocence. No way, right? Well, we're going to trace the massive shift away from that dark, terrifying demonology and towards rational philosophy. It's a monumental shift that built the very foundation of almost every single modern legal system in the world today. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with 1. The Dark Ages of Justice. Then move to 2. Beccaria and rational choice. Next is 3. Bentham's pleasure-pain principle. Followed by 4. The flaw of rigid rules. Then we'll cover 5. The neoclassical compromise. And wrap up with 6. The modern rational offender. So let's kick things off with Section 1. The Dark Ages of Justice. To truly appreciate why a revolution in legal thinking was so desperately needed, we have to picture the horrifying landscape it was reacting against. Through the medieval period and right into the 18th century, European criminal justice was, honestly, an absolute nightmare for the average person. We're talking about extraordinarily harsh and entirely arbitrary punishments. Torture wasn't just common, it was a routine, legally sanctioned tool used specifically to extract confessions. The death penalty was applied to a massive, sweeping range of offenses, completely regardless of their actual severity. And perhaps most frighteningly for everyday citizens, judges held almost unlimited discretion. An angry judge could literally sentence a poor man to death for stealing a loaf of bread, while a wealthy aristocrat might walk away with a minor fine for murder. There was zero consistency. It wasn't a calibrated system of law, it was sheer chaos, driven by raw, visceral retribution and that lingering residue of demonological thinking. That is exactly why the thinkers who came next framed their entire project as an urgent, life-saving reform movement. Which brings us to Section 2, Beccaria and rational choice. What's really fascinating about this next phase is the introduction of the man who essentially sparked the revolution, Cesare Beccaria. He was a brilliant Italian philosopher, and in 1764, he published a masterpiece called On Crimes and Punishments. It's arguably one of the most influential texts in the entire history of criminal justice. He wrote it as an impassioned, logical argument to humanize the law. His central assumption, and this is the absolute key idea you need to hold on to for this entire explainer, was a complete rejection of demonic possession. He argued that human beings are fundamentally rational actors. There is no external, invisible, spiritual force controlling them. Instead, it's just an ordinary person calculating whether a crime is actually worth the risk. They're constantly internally weighing the potential benefits, like money or revenge, against the likely costs of getting caught. Based on that revolutionary idea of rational choice, Beccaria demanded 3 concrete requirements for how society should punish people. First, punishments must be fixed by clearly written laws decided completely in advance, no more leaving someone's life up to a judge's arbitrary mood. Second, the punishment must be strictly proportionate to the crime. It shouldn't be a single drop more severe than what is absolutely necessary to outweigh the benefit of the offense. And third, and this is critical, punishment must be swift and certain. Beccaria deeply understood human psychology. He realized that a fast, absolutely guaranteed consequence actually deters behavior far more effectively than a horrific but highly unlikely one. Think about it. A guaranteed $50 ticket the absolute second you speed is going to change your driving habits way faster than a 1 in a million chance of being executed a year from now. We just naturally heavily discount delayed or uncertain risks. Because of this intense focus on practical deterrence rather than emotional revenge, Beccaria wanted to fundamentally humanize the law. Now, he didn't reject the idea of punishment entirely, but he insisted its only valid, logical purpose was to preserve public safety and order. Because of this, he argued strongly against both torture and the death penalty. He insisted they were not just cruel, but actually completely ineffective as long-term deterrents, because all they really did was normalize state violence. Moving right along to Section 3, Bentham's pleasure-pain principle. Building directly on Beccaria's foundation, an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham took these ideas and engineered them into a much broader, highly systematic philosophy. He introduced utilitarianism, which is driven entirely by the pleasure-pain principle. Bentham claimed that absolutely all human behavior is directed at maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. It's essentially a giant internal scale inside every human's mind.
When applied to crime, this is called the hedonistic calculus. It basically means an offender is actively, mentally weighing risks versus rewards right before they act. They are calculating the thrill or the financial payout on one side of the scale and the agony of prison time on the other. So for the state to actually prevent crime, it has to rig this mathematical equation. It must ensure the pain of the punishment reliably, consistently outweighs the pleasure or financial gain of the crime. This exact logic is the intellectual root of modern deterrence theory, and it is heavily used in policy everywhere today. Take Pakistan's sentencing debates surrounding heavy, organized offenses like drug trafficking and terrorism. The state's logic there explicitly relies on deterring future offenders by engineering the law so that the pain of punishment is certain and severe enough to mathematically outweigh the massive illicit gains of those crimes. Now, while Bentham largely agreed with Beccaria on avoiding unnecessary cruelty, he actually made a fascinating exception based on his pure utilitarian math. Bentham was somewhat more willing to accept certain harsh measures, including the death penalty, specifically for murder. He believed that if executing a killer effectively deterred others and saved multiple innocent lives in the future, it created a net positive of pleasure and safety for society. It's a slight but really important divergence in their classical approaches. Together, though, Beccaria and Bentham completely founded the classical school, giving us the absolute bedrock concepts we rely on today: the right to a speedy trial, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and the unyielding rule of written law. But that leads us to Section 4, the flaw of rigid rules. Because as we'll see, this first pure version of classical theory hit a massive practical wall when it was actually applied to the very messy reality of real human beings. I want you to think about this question for a second. Should a child and a cold-blooded assassin receive the exact same punishment? Because if punishment is rigidly fixed by written law in advance and judges are stripped of absolutely all discretion to alter it, the law is forced to treat everyone exactly the same. And that right there was the glaring, incredibly serious flaw of the classical system. Under strict classical theory, a teenager acting completely impulsively, a terrified person acting in genuine self-defense, and a cartel boss acting with cold, calculated premeditation would all receive the exact same rigid punishment if they committed what looked like the same offense on paper. The theory had absolutely no room for individual circumstances, mental state, age, or intent. A system that tried so desperately to be perfectly equal on paper ended up creating massive, heartbreaking inequality and injustice in real-world courtroom. Which perfectly sets up Section 5, the neoclassical compromise. This exact tension, the intense friction between perfectly equal laws and deeply unequal humans, gave rise to a necessary system update. Neoclassical theory cleverly kept the core classical assumption completely intact. Offenders are still viewed as rational actors who choose to commit crime, but it deeply softened the rigidity. It was a brilliant theoretical compromise. It preserved the fixed legal structure and deterrence-based punishment, but it reintroduced a controlled, bounded form of judicial discretion based on individual culpability. So instead of a rigid single penalty, judges were given a window, say 5 to 10 years. This allowed a judge to hand the minimum sentence to the impulsive teenager and the maximum sentence to the criminal mastermind, adjusting for the specific human context without completely breaking the overarching rules of the system. You can see this exact neoclassical compromise actively working in courtrooms today. Take Pakistan's legal system, for example. The law there explicitly recognizes categories like diminished responsibility. It acknowledges the reduced culpability of youth through protections like the Juvenile Justice System Act. And it structurally allows judges to weigh various mitigating circumstances at the time of sentencing. All of these legal realities reflect the neoclassical insistence that while the framework of law must be fixed and reliable, individual human circumstances absolutely have to matter. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the modern rational offender. Let's look at how these foundational 18th century philosophies continue to directly drive modern crime prevention right in our own neighborhoods today. Neoclassical theory's most direct modern descendant is rational choice theory. It keeps Beccaria and Bentham's core assumption of a calculating offender, but it zooms way in on the exact microprocess behind that choice. It analyzes what goes through an offender's mind at the very split second of a decision. Imagine a burglar looking at a house. They are checking for dogs, looking for open windows, assessing the lighting. Rational choice theory asks, what information do they have in that moment? What immediate risks do they perceive? What alternatives are available to them? This theory brilliantly translates into everyday situational crime prevention. Things like improved street lighting, highly visible security cameras, and target hardening, like installing tougher locks, aren't just random civic upgrades. These measures are literally designed to manipulate Bentham's hedonistic calculus in real time. They artificially increase the perceived risk, the expected pain, and the physical effort required to commit a crime, which shifts the math in the offender's head, convincing them to just walk away. We are quite literally using 18th century philosophy to design 21st century streetlights. So as we wrap up this explainer on the monumental shift from demonology to reason, I'll leave you with this provocative thought. Take a close look at your own local courts, or consider the systems we've discussed today, like Pakistan's current sentencing framework. When you see a verdict handed down on the news, ask yourself, is this system being driven by rigid, classical math, treating every single offense identically? Or is it leaning into the flexible, neoclassical compromise, adjusting for the messy, complicated reality of the human being sitting in the dock? Understanding this difference is the absolute key to understanding how justice is truly delivered today. Keep observing, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next one.